Hello and welcome to Deep Dive on NewsX World. I'm Asuma Katauka. Tonight we turn to the United States, where President Donald Trump has announced the withdrawal of National Guard troops from several major U.S. cities, marking what many are calling the end of a prolonged political and legal standoff. Let's break it down. On Wednesday, President Donald Trump said he is removing National Guard troops from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Portland. The move comes after a series of legal setbacks, including a Supreme Court decision that blocked the federal deployment of the National Guard in Illinois. Trump has claimed the troops had greatly reduced crime, but added a warning that he would not hesitate to redeploy them if crime begins to soar again. So, is this the end of a standoff? In practical terms, yes. Courts have made it clear that the president cannot unilaterally deploy National Guard troops for domestic operations unless civil authorities can no longer enforce the law. President Trump did not invoke the Insurrection Act, which would have allowed direct law enforcement powers. As a result, most troops were limited to guarding federal buildings and providing support roles. But why were these troops deployed in the first place? The deployments began after protests against mass immigration enforcement raids. Trump has argued that Democratic-led cities were suffering from out-of-control crime and disorder, that local leaders had failed. Democratic governors pushed back, calling the move political theater and a dangerous overreach of federal power. To understand the controversy, it helps to understand what the National Guard is and what it is not. The National Guard is a dual-role force. It serves governors for state emergencies like natural disasters and unrest, and it serves the president for federal missions and overseas deployment. Guard members are citizen soldiers with civilian jobs and lives. Crucially, they do not police civilians unless the Insurrection Act is invoked. Which brings us to the key question: did the National Guard actually reduce crime? Nationally, the data suggests crime was already falling. The FBI's 2024 Uniform Crime Report found violent crime went down 4.5%, property crime down 8.1%. A 2025 city-level study showed violent crime continued to decline in the first half of the year. In short, there was no national crime emergency. So why did the perception differ? Survey data from the American Communities Project shows attitudes about crime vary widely by location. In 2024, gun violence and crime ranked below issues like inflation, taxes, healthcare, homelessness, and drug addiction. Only one group, African American South counties, had more than 30% citing crime as a top concern. Most rural communities reported very low concern. What about cities with troops? In Washington, D.C., crime including homicide did fall during the deployment, but experts warn this does not prove cause and effect. Troops are stationed mainly in tourist areas, guarding buildings and providing visibility, not targeting high-crime hotspots. Criminologists say a visible uniformed presence can create a short-term different effect, but they also warn it is temporary and highly inefficient. And then there is the cost. Washington, D.C. alone, more than $200 million. Los Angeles, another $118 million. When you add Chicago, Portland, and Memphis, total costs could approach $2/3 of $1 billion. All for a strategy with limited short-term impact. Critics say this raised serious governance and rights issues. State leaders argued the deployments undermined federalism, escalated tensions, and normalized military presence in civilian life. Courts appear to have agreed. In the end, this was never just about crime. It was about power between states and Washington. Security and civil liberties, perception, and data. The troops are leaving for now, but the questions this episode raised about governance, law, and the use of force at home are far from settled. To discuss all of this and more, we are joined by Mr. Matthew Vadum. Thank you very much, Mr. Matthew Vadum, for joining us once again, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
Thank you for joining us. For the viewers, Mr. Vadum is an American journalist and author, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Now, going into my first question, Mr. Vadum, what do you make of President Trump's move, and what could be the reason behind it?
Well, it's pretty clear that President Trump is withdrawing the National Guard troops from Chicago, Portland, Oregon, and Los Angeles because he lost court cases. And most importantly, on December the 23rd, I think it was, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against his deployment in Chicago, Illinois, saying that he could not, under federal law, call up the National Guard in Illinois when it was still possible for the laws to be executed, for the laws to be enforced. There wasn't enough of a breakdown in law and order in Illinois, so the Supreme Court voted, I think it was 6-3, to say that he couldn't do that. So it was that loss at the Supreme Court that I think made the U.S. Department of Justice rethink their position and realize that it was untenable. And they decided this week to withdraw from those three cities. Now, President Trump has still deployed the National Guard in Washington, D.C. itself. Significantly, Washington, D.C. is not a state, it's a federal enclave. And it doesn't, it doesn't exercise state sovereignty. It can't make its own decisions 100%. And the president is commander-in-chief of the D.C. National Guard. So for the time being, the courts have allowed the deployment there to continue. Now, these deployments have not. Crime has been cutting down on crime has been offered as a justification, but the primary reason for these deployments was not to clamp down on crime in general. It was to protect federal immigration authorities who came under violent attack by leftist groups such as Antifa for doing their job and trying to enforce immigration law. Many of these leftists, have responded violently when Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has come in and tried to deport illegal alien criminals and just plain old illegal aliens, and they have laid siege to ICE offices throughout the country, and President Trump took the position that was interfering with federal immigration law enforcement. And so that's why the primary reason why these deployments of the National Guard by President Trump were ordered. So I think that point needed some clarification.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Vadum. And to my second question, were federal political priorities put over local safety in this whole saga? What's your take?
I say the question again, that what federal politics did to local politics?
Yes.
Well, federal law is supreme to state and local law, and President Trump decided it was an important national priority that his immigration enforcement agenda, which is deporting illegal aliens, was prioritized, and that doesn't prevent state and local police from enforcing their respective laws, but this added a new element because states, according to President Trump, states and localities were not helping. In fact, they were being distinctly unhelpful in federal efforts to enforce immigration law. So that's why President Trump federalized National Guard troops and sent them to the various locales in the United States.
Thank you for highlighting that. And lastly, Mr. Vadam, Trump said that crime is all-time high in these cities, but data from his own administration suggested that violent crime was on a downward trend. Oh, so what do you make of this?
I think that overall, for a few years, violent crime has been on a downward trend in the United States. However, since President Trump returned to office in January of last year, he has been living back in Washington, D.C., and there were a number of shocking violent crimes that had an impact on him. Two Jewish people, who were associated with the Embassy of Israel, were murdered on the streets in Washington, D.C. because they were Jewish. And a member of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, the roving squad of efficiency experts who had been cutting government spending, a member of that was also violently assaulted. And I think that President Trump took those assaults to heart. Now, Washington, D.C. is still a violent place. It's just that the trend has been downward in recent years, but it's not a place where people feel comfortable. And many people in D.C. have observed that life has been better for them since the National Guard troops have been stationed there since as of a few months ago in Washington, D.C. They feel that they can operate without fear of being attacked or in broad daylight or having their cars carjacked. And they feel better about life in general in Washington. And this is an anecdotal observation that I've heard from many people in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, technically, the statistics may show that violent crime is down in Washington, D.C., but to many people in Washington, D.C., it doesn't feel like that because there's still a lot of Washington, D.C. is still a violent place, and it still has too much criminal activity. So they felt that they were given a bit of a respite from that when President Trump sent in the National Guard to patrol the capital city.
With that, I would like to thank Mr. Matthew Vadam for joining us today from Washington, D.C. and sharing that insight with us on Deep Dive. Thank you very much. Now, that was all for this episode of Deep Dive. Stay tuned for more updates on NewsX World.